In this tutorial, which serves as a great follow-up to what we talked about last week with delay processing, will be delay throw strategies. Now, in order to get the most out of this tutorial, we have to try and lay down some guidelines or some rough definitions of what distinguishes the delay from the delay throw. It's really all about application because in the realm of music production, it's never a good idea to try to define something and say, this is the definition for everybody, because we all make music differently. So, of course, we define some of these techniques and ways of making music in different ways. Our music is all different, so the way we define things is probably going to be different as well. One of the main ideas in a lot of these tutorials is trying to figure out what is the most efficient way. And when we say efficient, it doesn't just mean time saving. It means what's going to work best. What is the application that you need a delay throw for? And then how is the best way to go about setting that up? So you'll see that there's always more than one way to do anything in the modern DAW. And it's good to know the differences so that when it comes to your music and, when you need this effect, that you know the best way to go about setting it up. And like all of our tutorials, the techniques shown can be applied in any DAW with the basic stock plugins. If we think back to last week, we really were dealing with delay. And when I was using the term delay, what I really meant was an effect that's constant. So you have a piano part playing for 4 bars. That delay is enabled for the entire time. It's okay to maybe have a little bit of automation, even just the level of the delay, but it's occurring for the entire part. That's really the key here to differentiating delay from delay throws. And then oftentimes that delay is used as a spatial effect, sometimes as a substitute for reverb. So even just like a slap back delay or something that's, a 16th note, an 8th note with just a couple instances of feedback. You don't have to use that reverb, but you then put a delay in place and you process that in a particular way, etc. This even extends to the very short delay times, the precedence effect or the Haas effect as it's known, where you're just perceiving one sound, but it's actually this sort of stereo widening effect because you're putting the channels out of phase with one another. But you normally do that for the entire part. That's not something that you just turn on for random moments. It actually can be, but if you're doing it in that context, it really would fall more into the delay throw category. And when I think about delay throws, I really think about emphasis. So you're only delaying a particular word, a phrase, a note, a drum hit. Whatever the case may be, it's not constant. And oftentimes this delay throw acts as something like a bridge. So you have, even in like a vocal expression, you might be talking and then you pause. And then I come back in order to fill out that gap between the word pause and then whatever it was I said after that, I might delay just that word pause. So it's pause, 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 and then I come back in. That's really the purpose and main usage of the delay throw. It's to put emphasis or in some cases to bridge a gap. It's intentionally used for contrast. So unlike some delays, which are used as more spatial effects or as a substitute for reverb, you really should hear this delay throw and register it as a particular effect, not a part of the track. And that again goes back to emphasis and contrast, 2 words that you should associate with the delay throw. And when it comes to automation, this is really where, the sky's the limit. It could be absolutely nothing to the most extreme automation that you've ever applied. And I want to make it clear that don't let the classic word throw confuse you. This is an old term that may or may not have anything to do with how you set up this particular effect in the modern DAW. And the term really harkens back to the days of the analog mixing consoles where you would set up a delay on some kind of a return track, and then you would take that send level and you would literally throw it just at the moment that you wanted it to like delay. So if it's a particular word, you turn it on, then you quickly turn it off again just so it gets that word and then it's delaying it. Of course, in the DAW, we can do more than just this classic approach. We can set this up in a variety of ways, and that's what we're going to be talking about. And of course, you're also not limited to whatever hardware delay device you have lying around. You can think back to the past tutorial where we talked about delay processing and make a really complex delay that is serving as a delay throw. And all of this will make a lot more sense as we move forward and look at the examples. For some techniques that we're going to be talking about in these tutorials, listening to music isn't always going to help you as much. It can be very difficult to hear how much something has been compressed in a song, for example, because there's so many things that you don't know. You don't know if they're actually starting with a raw recording. You don't know if they're actually working with, say, some kind of sample library. Some people with great ears can pick it out, but for the average listener, you may not know the difference. So how could you tell how much compression has been applied or what type of compressor is being used? It's really more useful to kind of just examine those techniques in isolation so that you get a feel and a hear for the effect. But when it comes to delay throws, these are used all the time in so much music that it makes sense to actually listen for them in the music that you enjoy. And this will help you better understand the where and the when. Where is this occurring? When is it occurring? And even in a lot of cases, why is it occurring? And that's something that we'll talk a little bit about here, but sometimes as a listener, it's better to figure that out on your own. Why did they use that particular chain on that delay throw? Was it for a particular reason? Does it help bridge these gaps? Is it an interesting contrast? Does it work in the context of the full song? And sometimes as a listener, you may feel like it doesn't work. Most of the time, though, it tends to, because delay is such an easy effect, and it's so easy for us to manipulate and kind of get in the pocket, again, as compared to something like, say, compression or EQ, where sometimes you just don't know if it's working or not because you have a very different taste to, the guy next to you and so forth. But our focus in this tutorial is going to be on the how. How do we set this up, and what are some of the techniques that we can use? So more often than not, these delay throws occur at the end of a phrase or at the end of a section. So if you are listening for delay throws, which I strongly encourage you do in the music you enjoy, make sure you're really listening closely at the end of phrases, or bridging between a chorus and a verse and a chorus and a bridge, from the intro to the outro, and so forth. We'll begin by setting up the throwback, the classic, and it really isn't a classic because it's still used all the time, but I think sometimes it's used this way just because people aren't aware of different ways they can set up this effect, so they always go with the default send-return configuration. Unlike an insert, which we'll talk about in the next example, you can control exactly what part of the signal is sending into the delay throw, and thus you get fine-tuned control over what gets delayed. So this will make a lot more sense when you put into the context of the next example, but let's jump into the DAW and talk about how this almost like a vintage technique was applied in the past and continues to get applied in the present. We're going to begin by talking about the classic delay throw setup. And it's called classic because it's really stood the test of time and continues to work to this day. If you ask 9 out of 10 music producers or 9 out of 10 mix engineers, this is probably the way that they would set it up. And it's so common and so useful that I set it up this morning. I set up another version later in the afternoon for a different project. I'm sure I'll do it tomorrow and the day after. Our examples in these tutorials are always done in isolation so that you can focus on the technique at hand, and also to make sure that I don't unintentionally inhibit your creativity by you watching me do this in the context of a busy mix and then thinking, oh, well, that's the only application for it. Absolutely not. These strategies, these techniques can be used all over the place, and it's really up to you to find how you want to implement this into your music if and when it's appropriate. Now, the reason this is the classic setup and why so many people use this method is, put simply, it works. No reason to break what isn't broken. It works, it will always work, and there's a reason, a particular reason why this send and return setup makes so much sense. And when we do the next example with the insert, you'll start to understand a little bit more why it is done this way so commonly. We're back to this poem. Lucky for you, I've chosen a different phrase, but let's just get familiar with it.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So what I want to do is I just want to delay the word somewhere. And this would be the perfect time to go to the delay throw technique because we don't want the delay to be constant. We want it to just be on that one isolated word. So to set this up, I'm going to go in, I'm going to add my delay to the return track here, have it 100% wet. I'll turn the feedback all the way down so it's just one repeat. And we can start by sending this in for the whole time.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So in theory, all I have to do is automate this parameter when we get to basically right before the word somewhere. And I can do that by either recording in this automation myself.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
And if we go back, we can look at that automation and we can listen to things.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
And I could always then go back in and change any delay parameter that I want, and it's not going to influence what's getting delayed. So I could change this to now a half note, add more feedback, close down this filter even a little bit more. We can listen to it.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So it's not changing what's getting delayed. Now, there are a couple of problems here. One of those problems is, let's imagine that I didn't want the effects processing on this actual audio track to go into the delay throw. Like, let's say that we have here, and we're just going to go for now, and we're going to turn this off and just bring this guy all the way down. Let's imagine that there's an EQ that's doing more of the like telephone effect, and then there's also a chorus on this.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
And then I go into the delay throw, and this time I'm just going to go ahead and set this up with automation. I'll just do it manually. So you can see that there's another way. I think this is about where the word somewhere comes in.
Somewhere.
Cool. But the problem is I want to go into this delay throw without all of this extra processing that's happening on the track. Because right now...
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
I can still hear that EQ and I can still hear the chorus effect. So you might think, oh, I could go in here and I could just change this to be pre. But, and here's the big part, is this pre-effects or is this pre-fader? Let's find out.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So I'm still hearing the effects, and what that's telling me is that this pre just stands for pre-fader. Okay, and so the difference here between pre-effects send and pre-fader send, which is really important, some DAWs do give you a pre-effects send, is that this pre is just saying pre this final fader right here. So if I turn this down really low and we play it back, what you can expect to happen is the delay throw is going to be really loud because it's not paying attention to this fader here. And so we can hear that obviously now the delay is louder because it's paying attention to this waveform, not what's been done here. But if I go in and then obviously change this to post, it's going to be so quiet you're probably not even going to hear the delay throw because now it is paying attention to this fader. So then we hear more of a balance, and you're also hearing some of that quantization noise, or at least I'm hearing it. Hopefully you're not hearing it, but that is just the reality of the situation. And so I don't have a pre-effects send, which means that if I was going to try and delay throw out that word and have it be unaffected, I'm going to have to do something a little bit different, and it's something that we will cover coming up in this tutorial. The insert is definitely a little bit more tricky, mainly because we have to deal with bleed. So the only time to really use the insert is when we're okay with getting that bleed over. So you apply the delay on the track, just like you would a regular insert, and then you send, or I should say, you automate the dry-wet control. So when it gets to that word or phrase that you want delayed, you quickly turn it on, and then you sort of have to wean your way off. Or in some cases, you're just turning it on. And you'll understand why this is. A dry-wet mix set to 0 doesn't mean the effect is bypassed. It just means that you're not hearing any of that balance. You're not hearing any of the delay, but it's always happening. The signal is just coming through and you're not hearing the result of the effect. Therefore, when you automate the dry-wet control, you get parts of the signal in the delay that you may not have intended. And this is exactly the opposite to the send and return, where you're only sending in the dry signal that you want delayed. And that's what the delay is going to react to. Here, when you're turning up the dry-wet mix, it's turning up everything that's in there. So whether or not that's what you want, that determines whether or not you use this particular strategy. And sometimes this can work really well, and it works in kind of an unexpected way. You might have been intending to set this up like the classic, but it ends up sounding a lot cooler this way. And then again, a lot of times it just completely falls on its face and you get frustrated because you're trying to automate something perfectly where the setup is actually the problem. It has nothing to do with your automation or, your live turning the knob up and down. So if you wanted to slowly bring in a delay effect, like have it come in and be really prominent in the middle of a part and then kind of fade back away, putting a delay on an insert is a great way to do that, but that's not really a delay throw anymore. That's using delay more in the traditional way and just kind of automating the amount that you're hearing, so automating the volume. But you can also do it with the dry-wet mix if you want to set it up directly on the track. But our focus here is on delay throws, and we're going to look at some of the issues that you might run into and when those issues can actually be strengths. I think for the first time in these technical tutorials, we're going to be applying an insert effect. And when I say insert effect, I just mean on the actual audio channel path itself. So going right here onto the poem directly. So we'll just actually start by adding a chorus because this is going to be really important basic knowledge to understand what the difference is between the insert and the send and return setup. So I bring on my chorus.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
I set my balance like so. I bring on my delay, and notice what happens if I bring this mix down to 0. We know that we have these little faders. They're very small, but they indicate to us what the signal is going right here, basically from the clip gain and then into this first chorus and then going into the delay and then coming out of the delay. But even with this mix at 0,
yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
I could still go in here post delay at 0% mix and add another effect.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
And I don't have any problems doing that. And that's because this mix value here, this isn't a bypass control on the delay at all. If I turn this up, we're going to hear the delay that's been happening. It's just been put down to 0 here on the mix. That doesn't mean that the effect still isn't working. You're just not hearing any of that balance. Compare that to the send and return, where we're going to see the signal coming in.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
But because we're not sending, there's nothing happening beyond just
Yet I know that they keep their vigil.
What's going on at that channel level. And so what's the problem with this? Well, we're going to listen and we're going to find out. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to set this time up like so. This looks good enough for me. All right, let's just find the word somewhere.
Somewhere.
Let's just send it in here. And that sounds okay, just listening to that in real time. But let's hear what happens when we now go and play this back from the beginning. So this is our delay throw. Remember, just because the word is throw, we don't have to do it in manually or anything like that. We can just use automation. But now listen to what happens.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
We clearly haven't isolated the word somewhere, and it's going to be very difficult for us to do that given the settings that we have. And the reason is because this delay is happening the entire time. So if we get rid of this automation and just listen to it with this mix value set at 30.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil.
Okay.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So when we start to turn this up in real time, we're actually getting any sort of bleed that's been left over. So it has been delaying this entire time as compared to sending in here where it's only receiving what we send in. completely different. And this is why the insert approach is really what we would call the bleed approach. And actually, we could do this in more of a group situation as well. If I go in here and I choose to use some kind of an effects layer, which I know you all have seen me do now a few times, we can set up one of these to just be the dry version, or in this case, the version with chorus, and then one version that's going to be the delay. And what we would do in this instance is we would still set this up to be 100%, but now instead of automating the dry wet control, we would automate this volume. And this explains it better because you're going to be hearing, even at these lower volumes, that the delay is happening constantly.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So by trying to just automate this up at the word somewhere, we can hear that there's that buildup that's going on. So we'll start it down here and then bring it up to something like that and just listen to how this works.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
In reality, we'd really actually want this coming up after the word somewhere.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
But it can be a very difficult effect to set up, and normally I would actually not put this in a chain, and I would just probably do it in this kind of a fashion here and try to automate the mix control so that you don't get kind of those imbalances in volume, but you can see the difficulty of this. Now, for something like a vocal, this won't work particularly well, but if you have an instrument part, drums, synthesizers, piano, etc., that little bit of bleed isn't always a bad thing because you can kind of tease it early on. So we could take the mix control here and do something a little bit more fun and more experimental. You know, we could do something like this.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So a very different sort of technique, a very different sound, but something that you can experiment with. It's not going to allow you to isolate a single word or a single phrase, but it will allow you to keep a little bit of that bleed over. And sometimes that's a great effect. You just have to experiment and see when it works and when it doesn't. One of my personal favorite strategies doesn't involve a delay plugin at all, and it's what I refer to as the duplicate method. So many of you are probably sitting there thinking, if you're not using a delay plugin and you're not automating any sort of control, how is this a delay throw? And by classical definition, it really isn't. But you don't want to be looking at these things via classical definition. You always want to be looking at them in terms of application and result. And the result of this strategy is exactly the same as what it would be if we were to set up that send and return effect and delay throw into it. Only here we have perfect fine-tuned control with great visual feedback. And that's the beauty of the modern digital audio workstation and also non-destructive audio editing. It's not like we're going to be maxing out CPU by adding another track, and we get all this additional control from, the clip editor if you have something like that, where you can easily control volume, pan, and even pitch if you want to do that. So the way this works is you duplicate the audio track, you cut out the part of the signal that you want delayed, and then you just move it onto the timeline. And if you want to get fancy, you can duplicate it multiple times and have those nice rhythmic intervals or irregular intervals, whatever you want to do. Very simple and effective. And this can be especially effective for those single repeats. So you just want that one extra bit of emphasis coming at the last word of a phrase. And with this strategy, you are guaranteed to repeat or delay exactly what you want when you want it. And that's kind of the point of the delay throw to begin with. The duplicate method is one of my personal favorites when you want the classic delay throw effect, but you want to have different effects processing on both, or specifically, you don't want the effects processing that's happening on the channel itself. So if we go in here to our poem and we add a chorus and we add some kind of like distortion, let's imagine that I want the thrown version to be completely clean.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So as things stand now, if I was to go and set up the classic model and send into that, there's no way for me to remove this effects processing that's happening on the channel itself. However, what I can do is I can always go and I can duplicate this, call this the delay throw, put them together in a group just for good organization. And I can go and I can isolate one of these words. For example, I'm going to again go and isolate that word.
Somewhere.
So we'll just go, we'll cut it out, we'll grab it. And I did not mean to do that, so let's just check it out.
Somewhere.
Okay.
Me. Somewhere. Somewhere.
So I have that word, and now if I want that to be the delay, what I'll do is I'll just go in here and I'll get rid of these two effects. So if we listen to it, it's just the original now.
Somewhere.
And now I could go and I could set this wherever I wanted it in relation. So let's say I want it to happen here.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
It's probably too far away.
Somewhere.
And you can hear how stark of a difference that is, but this is a pretty powerful effect.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. Somewhere.
Something like that. And I could then go and I could just duplicate this again over and over again. And we'll just say that I want it lined up. This is clearly being done just at the spur of the moment. If I was doing this in a song, I know exactly where I wanted it.
Somewhere. Somewhere. Somewhere.
And then I can go and use my clip editing abilities. And I could do things like take this version and I could turn it down. And I could take the pan and I could pan this one off to the left. I could take this one and I could turn it down. And I could pan this one off to the right. And we could then go and just kind of listen to how this works. So if we go back to the original, I'm going to have to turn this down probably further.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. Somewhere. Somewhere.
Somewhere.
And somehow I also changed the pitch, which is something I didn't mean to reveal to you right now, but you can do that too. I mean, that's kind of a big part of this, is that you can go and you can manipulate all of these in any way that you want. And I could, of course, take this a step further. And yeah, why don't we actually take this one, bring it down by just 1, and we'll take this one and bring it down by 2. And then we could go and we could add some kind of other effect to this, like, I don't know, a reverb of some kind. And this is all being done in the spur of the moment. And let's add the rotary too. That one's always fun. There it is.
Somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
And now if we listen to it all together.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
Somewhere. Somewhere. Somewhere.
So something like that you can set up and do very easily. We're not using any kind of a delay. We're just working with our basic tools. And far too often, and this is a personal opinion, but I think far too often we rely so heavily on all of the little gadgets and stuff in our plugin folder that we forget that when we really want something specific, sometimes it's just a matter of chopping something out and then working with it and manipulating it right from your timeline. So experiment with that. Maybe you'll have use for it, and then again, maybe you won't. By extension, we have the duplicate and bounce method. So with this method, it's not very easy to explain it theoretically through a slide, but when we go into the example, you'll definitely understand and see the benefits for this. And really with the duplicate and bounce, what you get is a convenient way of delaying exactly what you want with the flexibility of adding multiple repeats, or if you're using a tap delay, getting kind of exactly where you want each of those taps to occur. Bouncing this then, if you take it one step further, which you don't have to do, will give you more control over the repeats and then visually maybe easier to work with. So selfishly, I'm very used to working in the modern DAW, and I love all the visual feedback I get. And I just feel more comfortable seeing that waveform on the screen than I do of just having a plugin and then hearing kind of like phantom noise coming out. So you don't have to bounce things if you don't want to, but it can be useful. And especially if you work with fancier delay plugins, CPU is always such a major concern of the modern music producer that if you have to do a variety of these and you're using fancy delay plugins, they can start to take up a lot of CPU. So if you use this method and then you bounce out the delay throw, you can delete the plugin and you can go in and do even more fine-tune editing, get even fancier, add different processing chains, all while saving CPU and giving you a nice little visual feedback. The duplicate and bounce method is very rare. You're not going to see a lot of people doing this, at least not the traditional music producer or traditional mix engineer. But all of us are unique, so I think you can handle it. And this is something that I do a lot with music when I need really fine-tuned control, and or if I'm looking to save CPU on like a fancier delay plugin. We're not going to use any fancy delay plugins here, but you'll still get the gist of what we're going to try and do. So we'll start by duplicating this again. That's the first step. This is going to be the delay throw version, and we'll put the two of these guys in a group. Now, what I need to start by doing is, again, isolating the word that I need. But in this example, since I am going to be using a plugin, I'm not going to move it. I'm just going to set that plugin dry wet to be 100%. So this is almost like a parallel configuration. So I'll just grab this section of it here, and when we listen, it's just going to sound louder.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
But if I go in and I add some kind of a delay plugin to this, and let's go in and use something maybe a little bit different. We'll grab the Freak Echo, and I'm going to go ahead and set this mix to be 100%. Now when we hit that point, it's going to be a delay throw. But again, we don't want to have the whole thing playing out. We just want that isolated word.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
And let's increase the delay time. We'll take it to a quarter note.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
So we'll do something like this just to make it a little bit more complicated.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. Somewhere. Somewhere.
What I actually want to do is make this a little bit longer, so I'm going to try to use a half note.
Yet I know that
Sometimes
they
the
keep their
display doesn't
vigil
update.
and wait for me somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
Okay, that's cool. And I might even go on here and take this a little bit further by adding some kind of additional effect to this. Let's see if we have anything really interesting in here. We can try to use maybe something like this.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
Okay, this would be a great example of this. All right, so we have our delay followed by our distortion device. So now what I need to do is I need to bounce just this delay throw version. So this is very interesting. I'm going to consolidate this, and I'm just going to increase the length of this track just to make sure that I get it all. And then I'm going to go and I'm going to bounce just this delay throw. What's really interesting is you're not even going to see any signal happening at this moment. Again, our mix is set 100% wet, and this is a delay, so it's going to be appearing further on. So I'm just going to go ahead here and bounce this. And exactly like I said, you can see that. And now I can get rid of these two plugins here, use this as my delay throw, and now I have that fine-tuned control over the signal. So if I play this back.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
And for example, let's say that I actually didn't want these additional ones getting so much quieter. I can actually bring the level up.
Somewhere. 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 Somewhere.
And almost balance that out. And I could even then go, and if I want to get really fancy, I could start splitting these instances out. And then I could go into like each of these, for example, and I could say, okay, I want the pitch to be up 1, want the pitch to be up 2, want the pitch to be up 4, want the pitch to be up 7, want the pitch to be up 12, and then I could get rid of this last repeat.
somewhere, 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 somewhere.
Maybe on this last one, I'll actually like automate that.
Somewhere, 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 somewhere.
And then again, we could even go and take this a step further and add some kind of additional effect to this. So we could go and we could take something like the towel chorus.
Somewhere, 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 somewhere.
And then do something like that. So listening to it all back.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere, 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 somewhere.
And obviously, I'd still have to go in there and get the balance right, but you get the idea, and you can see how powerful this can actually be. Not only can it save you on CPU, but just like we saw with the regular duplicate method, you can then go in and get fine-tuned control over each of these repeats, or even if you don't want to split those out, you can just add some of these different curves and moves and just adjust things ever so slightly. And I could even go, and with this program, I should be able to take all of these guys here, hopefully. There we go. And I could go and I could take something like pan and I could just add like crazy chaos to it. Let's bring the mean back a little bit. Spread this out. Let's just listen to see what that did.
Somewhere, 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 somewhere.
So we could get some additional, just variations, very simply, just a couple of mouse clicks, and definitely a powerful technique, but not something that you're probably going to set up every day. Now that we've seen all of these methods in practice, it makes sense to take a little bit of a step back and just do a review. Mainly because I want to make these points. Every strategy has its place and has its application. What this really comes down to is you figuring out and finding what method is either most comfortable for you or what makes the most sense given the application. Everything changes based on your music. So don't think that just because, I really like the way the duplicate and bounce method looks, and I like the control and flexibility. It doesn't mean that you're always going to want to go through all of those steps, especially if you're really in the groove working on a song. Who knows? It always depends. For example, the insert throw can be the most frustrating, but does work really well if you want a little bit of that bleed over. And this can work particularly well for synthesizers, instruments, programmed drums, but it won't work too great on vocals unless you're doing something a bit more experimental, because chances are if you do this method and it's the insert, when you start to turn up some of that dry wet balance, you're going to get part of the previous word. And normally that's not what you're going for. You want to isolate a particular phrase or a particular word and just delay that. The duplicate and bounce gives you the most control, but it also takes the longest to set up. Adds another track into your project, creates a new audio file if you bounce it, and must be set up manually each and every time that you want to go for something like this. It's not something that you can easily just replicate. Like if you have a send and return, you can use that same send and return a variety of times, and that can be a positive. It can also be a negative here. The classic throw is the most convenient, but it can start to get confusing when you need variation and automation. So suddenly your return track has 5 or 6 additional processing effects, like we talked about with processing delay, but in order to get that extra variation, you have all sorts of crazy automation lines going on, and that can start to get confusing. And so maybe then it doesn't make sense to work in that way. Really, each and every time you need a delay throw, it is important to take 4 or 5 seconds to think, okay, what method is going to work best? What's going to be most efficient given the scenario? Just like with regular delays, with delay throws, you're going to want to process these guys to get that little bit extra variation. All of the things we talked about last week still apply here. And so if you are a little bit curious, if you didn't watch last week, I highly recommend that you go back to the previous tutorial and rethink some of these concepts, because they apply for regular delays and they apply for delay throws. Remember that in certain situations, less is going to be more. You don't have to process all of your delays heavily. It can be very subtle. It can be slight and then can get you the result that you want. Over-processing is just as dangerous as under-processing, but like always, take these ideas further and experiment away. On now to something that we didn't cover as much in the previous tutorial, automation. And automation can be a very big part if you want it to be. Automating your effects processing on delay throws is a great subtle or extreme way to add that little extra contrast or variation to not only the different delay throws that you have going on, but even if there's multiple feedback, having each instance be that little bit different, that can go quite a long way. There are some classics like a filter closing down, pitch rising or falling, adding more reverb to each repeat. The pan position is a classic. The amount of distortion, it goes on and on and on. Again, this is where you're just going to have to experiment away and sort of start to find some sounds and some techniques and, really even just some particular parameters that are going to then be unique to you and your music. And I do encourage you song by song to go back to some of the things that are going to work or that you think sound particularly cool. It's a great way to define your sound and to have something that can help, bring a lot of your tracks together, something familiar for your listeners. Expectation, that's a big part of music and something that you don't want to shy away from. We finally come to automation, and sadly it's something that we didn't discuss in the previous tutorial, but is a big part of delay processing, and it even is something that we've hinted at a little bit, and something that you saw with just the clip automation, going in and changing things like pitch, pan, volume by hand and making each version different. That's a form of automation, but now we'll get in more to the maybe classicer sense of the word and automate certain parameters on additional plugins. So what we have here is our poem, and we'll just review the classic delay throw setup. So it doesn't have to be anything too fancy here. We'll just use the delay 1. Get a decent amount of feedback. We'll put it to quarter notes here, and we'll just send in on that word.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
Let me get that right where I want it.
Yet I know for me somewhere. For me somewhere.
Cool, so I'm happy with that. The one thing I might do is actually even go and compress this kind of hard on the way in.
For me somewhere. For me somewhere. For me somewhere.
Cool, that's about what I wanted.
Somewhere.
And now what we can start to think about is automating particular parameters or particular effects. So let's start by just opening up this filter and do something that's a little bit more classic. We can take the filter device and we can just start to close this down with each repeat. And the one annoying thing is that I do have to do this on the return track, which is not something that I normally would want to do, but it's something that I'm going to have to do here. And this is why I like using the duplicate method quite a bit, or the duplicate and bounce method, because I just like seeing that audio waveform to know what's happening. Here it's like automation is happening on something invisible, but there's a lot of people who are comfortable doing it this way. So you just have to use your imagination, which I know is quite a struggle for most of us. Here we go. I'm just going to close this down in time.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So you can hear that like so, and just so you get a better feel for the repeats, I'm going to just take the post gain and just bring that up as well.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere.
So something like that is very simple. Or you could go and you could take something like a reverb and actually just automate like the dry wet on this so that each repeat sounds like it's going further and further into the distance. Always a fun one. So just using some of the default settings here. We want the dry wet control. Yeah, we'll just bring it up like so. We'll go more extreme than you probably would.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere, 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 somewhere.
So that's maybe not the greatest example in the world, but it can work depending on what you have going in.
For me somewhere, 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 somewhere.
That's a little bit better. Something like distortion is also a really fun one. Either the first repeat being more distorted than each version becoming less, or the exact opposite, adding more and more distortion each time. So we'll do something along these lines here. We'll automate that frequency control too, because that's a fun one. We'll bring this up to 100 and then just mess around with the frequency control.
For me somewhere, somewhere,
Too much feedback, and that's what happens. But you can obviously use your imagination and kind of explore these guys even further. One thing that's nice if you have something like a step sequencer in your DAW is that you could use this, and because we have this going at a quarter note, we could also have this move at a quarter note, and we could put some kind of effect in here and then just adjust various parameters on it. So let's use like a flanger, for example. And let's see if we can get this to work the way that I want it to. This can sometimes be a little bit more of a mystery. And we'll modulate the mix control, and we'll modulate something like feedback. We can do that if we're careful with it. Width, amount, all of these things. And so when it's going through here, and we'll just kind of randomize this. And you can now see all these parameters jumping around. And let's see how and if that makes any kind of effect.
Yet I know that they keep their vigil and wait for me somewhere, 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 somewhere.
So something cool like that could even possibly work. Now, I have to say and state at this point that you really have to experiment on your own with this. There is no go-to technique when it comes to automating your delays, but you probably should still experiment and try it out, because you can get so many interesting sounds, and sounds that really will differentiate you from everybody else. I know when I listen to music and I hear people do new things with delay, it keeps my interest throughout the track. So maybe I'm just one person, but you'll have my interest at the very least, and that's something that you can be proud of. Automation goes hand in hand with variation. So even though in the last slide I was talking about, wanting to appeal to expectation, there's also an element of variation in there. This is all about finding that balance. This last bullet is probably the most important point from the entire presentation. It's useful to have go-to delay throw chains and even just delay processing chains in general, but you'll also want variation within a track. So if that means setting up some macro controls, if you have that option, by all means, make sure that you do that so that you can get those subtle bits of variation so that things don't start to get a little bit too cliche, or really they just start to become boring. That's part of the reason why we're going to the delay throw, is to get us that variation. But when that variation gets repeated too many times, it loses its effect. So there has to be some sort of change up, some kind of variation that will keep the listener engaged all the way through. Now, these variations don't have to be extreme. They don't have to be major. It can be very subtle things, but just make sure that you're thinking about that. Or at the very least, when you're going through and listening to your music, is it starting to become too repetitive? Are you way too easily able to know what's coming next? And when that happens, that's the time to go in and start making some of those variations. So this is about finding a balance that works for your track. And remember that every single track you work on will end up being different. To wrap things up, for more processing ideas for your delay throws, please review the previous tutorial. We spent over an hour and a half talking about all the different ways that you can process your delays. And it would be a disservice if you just watched this video and didn't watch the previous one, because they really do go hand in hand. All of the things that you can do to your constant delays, so delays happening throughout a part, you can also do to your delay throws. The delay throw is a classic effect that has evolved beyond cliche with the flexibility of the modern DAW. So just remember that you can break convention whenever you want to break convention. It's there for you. There are times where it makes sense to work within the bounds of cliche or within the bounds of expectation. But then when you're trying to be unique, when you're trying to define your sound, going outside of that bubble a little bit, it probably can't hurt, or you can always try it and then go back to Old Faithful if it's not getting you the results you want. Remember that there is no best method every time. You need to do what you think serves the situation the best. You can find the best processing chain, but it's not going to work each and every time. It's going to be different depending on the part, depending on the type of music that you're making, depending on the vibe you're going for. Really, when it comes to making music, it's never about just finding that one perfect thing. It's about finding all of the things that come together in a really nice, cohesive sort of blend. So take these ideas and push them further. I certainly can't wait to see what you guys are able to come up with your delay throws.